Hello and welcome to Crossing Channels. I'm Richard Westcott. Is intellectual capital the key to future prosperity? That's the subject of the latest in our collaboration between the Bennett School of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse at the Toulouse School of Economics. As ever, we're going to draw on the interdisciplinary strengths of both institutions to explore a complex issue: how economies are increasingly built on knowledge and ideas, how countries accumulate this intellectual capital, and what it means for growth, innovation, and the distribution of opportunity. To explore these issues today, we have Diane Coyle from Bennett School. Diane, start us off. What does your research focus on?
I'm an economist and I focus on the digital economy, innovation, and productivity.
And joining us from TSE, we have César Hidalgo. César, remind us of your main research interests.
I'm a physicist and I explore the growth, diffusion, and value of knowledge.
Over the past few decades, the way economies generate prosperity has been shifting. Much of today's value now lies in ideas, software, data, brands, design, and know-how, rather than factories or machinery. Recent work shows that in many countries, businesses now invest at least as much in intangible assets, such as software, R&D, and design, as they do in physical assets, with the gap widening since the late 2000s. And the OECD notes that this kind of knowledge-based capital is increasingly central to productivity and living standards. So what does this shift actually mean? Diane, in your work, you've shown how modern economies have become increasingly powered by knowledge, design, and data. Why have they shifted, and what differences has it made, both good and bad?
Well, in a sense, the economy has always been powered by knowledge because the resources that the planet gives us have been there since the dawn of recorded time. You know, we've got the minerals and the plants and the animals and the humans. And so all of economic growth has been about people learning to use these materials in different ways, about generating clever ideas, whether it's sharpening a flint to turn it into a tool or whether it's generative AI models today. But that share that's due to ideas and knowledge has been increasing over time and sort of builds on itself like a snowball. In economics, this is called endogenous growth theory, and the ideas that people generate then become the material for further ideas that get generated. And so all of this knowledge builds on itself. And that means the share of economic value as we measure it through GDP that's due to intangibles of the kind that you mentioned in your introduction has been increasing substantially over time. And one way that's reflected is in the share of manufacturing products in economies, which for the UK is now less than 10%, and even for manufacturing intensive countries like Germany and Japan is dramatically lower than it used to be in, say, the 1960s and 70s.
And César, your work explores how knowledge is built through networks of people, firms, and technologies. So can we drill down into that a bit? Is intellectual capital something held by individuals or companies or whole societies or all of them? And how does knowledge turn into actual value?
That's a great question. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to understand. Diane was absolutely correct by saying that all of the growth comes from knowledge. That is something that we've known for a long time, and that was particularly revolutionary during the 80s and 90s when endogenous growth theory came about. And that comes from a property of knowledge, which is this idea that knowledge is non-rival. This is the idea that I can copy it without depleting it. So I can teach you a song, but I don't lose that song. Now, what I've been focusing quite a bit in my research is another property of knowledge, which is the idea that knowledge is non-fungible. Basically, it's made of bits and pieces that are extremely specific, so you cannot accumulate it like you accumulate water inside a barrel. It's something more complex than that. So you cannot change a surgeon with a pianist, even though they're both very skilled, they have dexterous hands and so forth. So what that means is that now when we're talking about the accumulation of knowledge, we're talking about a couple of things. One is this snowball effect. You know, knowledge is increasing and it is growing. But the other one is that this snowball is very colorful, we can say, meaning that it's highly differentiated. So when it comes to the accumulation of knowledge, we have to ask ourselves, well, how is that knowledge accumulated? And at which points the accumulation of knowledge transcends the capacities of individuals, teams, firms, and so forth. And when we look at the accumulation of knowledge at a large social scale, we realize that the knowledge that we have accumulated as a society is much larger than the one that we can fit in an individual or in a team. So we have a lot of differentiation, a lot of division that happens simply because this is a let's say, suprahuman quantity, one that needs to be distributed because of this non-fungibility, but also because of this non-rivalry, which means that it has grown to enormous amounts, even though it is differentiated.
I'm curious, actually, for both of you, do we have any idea what impact AI might have on the knowledge economy and inequality around the world?
AI is interesting because it's a communication technology, and there are two kinds of technologies that economists label general purpose technologies that have profound effects through the economy, and that's either energy technologies or communications technologies. And so AI will change the way people can access knowledge, but also change the combinations of knowledge that may be possible. So on the one hand, this will tend to reinforce some inequalities because the countries or the regions or the firms that already have the right kinds of skills and know how to be able to take advantage of it will start to do much better. On the other hand, it does increase the possibilities of access. And so countries that are lower income or middle income now may be able to take advantage of some of the specific knowledge that they have and amplify it using the technologies, which is a long-winded way of saying I don't think we know yet where it will go, and that there are certainly risks that it will increase inequalities, but I think it will have dramatic effects, just as printing did back in the 16th century.
César, what's your view on the impact of AI?
Yeah, that's an important question and one that is on everyone's mind. I was last week in London promoting my book, and I realized that there's like a law of book promotion that no matter what the book is about, you're going to get a question about AI at least. And this question, I think, is one that is on everyone's mind because, of course, everybody's using AI. But it's also a question that I think it makes sense to inform using formal models, and that's what has shaped my thinking about it. So on the one hand, a lot of people that ask that question come from the perspective that, well, AI makes some knowledge or at least some capability very easily accessible. And therefore, they think that it's going to flatten the world. Everybody's going to have access to, this knowledge that is distributed through these technologies. But on the other hand, when we look at models and when we understand that knowledge is not a thing, it's highly differentiated and it's based on all of these complementarities, we realize that AI is at best an input to the production of other things. So imagine you want to build a bridge. Well, building a bridge might require, calculations, procuring the materials, might require a lot of different things, and AI might help in some of those tasks, but it's not going to build the bridge completely. So when you understand that doing things, it's a combination of a lot of complementary inputs, and AI is only one of them, you realize that actually AI is going to generate the best returns to places that have those complementarities. To put it in simple terms, AI is a better news for Oxford than for Leicester, let's say in the UK, because Oxford has a lot of the complementary inputs that people would need to use AI with. Maybe you're using AI for the pharmaceutical industry. In Oxford, there's a lot of people that know about biology and so forth. In Leicester, maybe the industries that are there do not have such strong complementarities with AI. So if we understand that knowledge is actually made of this infinite alphabet, of all of these complementarities, then AI would have higher returns, would be more important in the places that have those complements.
I should add that we're doing both AI and biomedicine in Cambridge as well as in Oxford, so we're sitting pretty. But looking back to the previous examples actually does support that idea of reinforcing existing advantage. If you think about either telephony or the early days of the internet, people initially thought that would mean the death of distance, that places would level out. And actually it's led to much more concentration of economic activity and high value economic activity in certain centres of research.
And César, you're allowed to say the name of your book, The Infinite Alphabet.
The Infinite Alphabet, yes.
And Diane's just been saying how good it is.
I finished it last night. It's a terrific read. I do recommend it.
So let's talk about how we measure the invisible. So Diane, you talk about traditional indicators like GDP, missing the value created by ideas and other intangible assets. Do you think our current measurement tools are equipped to recognise its contribution, or are we still relying on approaches built for a very different kind of economy?
So you've asked me about my favourite subject, Richard, measuring things. And the short answer to the question is no, we're not equipped to measure it well. My last book, The Measure of Progress, pointed out that even for the existing changes that digital technologies brought in the economy, we're just not measuring some of the important phenomena, such as the free goods and services, how to account for those in the economy, or the extent to which companies have reorganised their production in global value chains, taking advantage of digital communications and so on. So we're already in a bad place. We're not good at measuring intangibles. And because we don't know how AI is going to reshape the economy, it's just quite hard to say what we should be measuring now. With one of my colleagues here, John, we've got a new paper, which we can put a link to, talking about what might we start to measure to understand whether AI is going to be transformational or not. And that's everything from the inputs, the computer power and the energy that it needs. But what we really want to understand is how is it reshaping the rest of the economy? And I think that means understanding much better how firms are going to reorganise themselves or reorganise the networks they work in to take advantage of these new knowledge possibilities. And that is something, one of the intangible capitals that people talk about is organisational capital. And we don't really have a good handle on how to measure and understand what kinds of reorganisation will go on in the economy to take advantage of the possibilities that AI enables.
I guess one of the issues is companies don't yet know how they're going to use it. So when we talk about biomedicine in Cambridge, for example, they're looking at using AI for improving clinical trials and finding new drugs and actually just improving the way a hospital runs, but no one actually knows what to do yet.
And it's all about the coordination among different people. And I think that's the sort of missing link in the AI conversation. A lot of attention obviously focuses on jobs for understandable reasons, but how will it change those possibilities of knowledge combination and repackaging, recombining knowledge and know-how that César was talking about?
Did you once tell me that if you book a holiday in a travel agent, it counts as being more productive than if you book it on a mobile phone?
Well, there's a transition from paying somebody to provide the service, which counts in GDP, and doing that same activity yourself, which does not count in GDP. So the activity gets done, but there's a switch from what we measure as the economy to what we don't measure as the economy.
It's really interesting. The Economic Complexity Index that you and your colleagues developed, César, is now widely used as a way of capturing the knowledge and know-how embedded in what countries are able to produce. So to what extent do you think measures like this can help us understand a nation's intellectual capital and its prospects for future prosperity?
Enormously. So I think the Economic Complexity Index helped us formalize something that has been hard to formalize until now, which is to create measures that honor the idea that knowledge is non-fungible. And they leverage something that is a little bit different from the other measures. So measures like GDP and so forth. The Economic Complexity Index is a measure that is not extensive in that sense. It is a measure that is more intensive and that leverages something that is different, which is the patterns of specialization that different economies have. So we have been able to show now more formally in mathematical models and papers that it is possible to infer the number of letters that a country or a city or a region would have of this infinite alphabet based on these matrices of specialization. Because in much of the previous work, we always try to find aggregates, while in this one, we're trying to create a measure of a structure that endogenously determine the value of each one of the units, and that provides us a measure of the diversity of knowledge that would exist in a location, measured indirectly by the activities that are present in them.
In your experience, César, are governments getting their head around the changes that are coming along, the changes in the way you would measure things like data and AI, or are they sort of looking at it a bit like a rabbit in the headlights, not quite knowing what to do?
There's a lot of different places in the world, so I wouldn't make categorical judgment about that. And I think some places are very forward-looking and progressive in the use of data and AI. Some are less. I do a lot of economic development work, and I find that usually when I travel outside of Europe, I see an attitude towards data and AI that is much more encouraging and hopeful. In Europe, I see an attitude that is, a little bit more fearful when it comes to those technologies. And I'm starting to think that there might be a reverse digital divide coming up, in which now developing countries that have access to all of these technologies might be more prone to adopt them and use them than the developed countries that are fearful of them, and that might generate a change in their adoption and their applications as well.
I don't think the economics profession has helped governments think about this, actually. César's work has been absolutely pioneering, along with Ricardo Hasman, but that's not the standard way that governments and policymakers think about how to grow the economy. Standard economics is about averages, it's about aggregating things. And as we've been discussing, you need to get underneath that to understand the differentiation and the different kinds of knowledge that are needed. And there are some great examples in the book of that not being exactly what you might think, that if you're a region or a city and you want to grow into new kinds of activities and increase economic complexity, the pathways that you might take are actually not always the obvious ones. Maybe César, you should give some of the examples because they're fantastic.
So I think there's some examples of diversification being a little bit counterintuitive. I use one of them in my book that involves a steel case. This is an American company that is a big player in the manufacturing of office furniture. And I visited a steel case many years ago with a group of students. We were doing, a project in which we were trying to design a potential visualization tool for their internal needs. And we visited their plants in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this is a company that is involved in real-time manufacturing, meaning that they don't manufacture to put things in a warehouse and sell them later. They manufacture only after something has been sold. What was interesting is that even though this was a furniture manufacturing company, they were not really worried about the material inputs, the price of wood or the price of metal that they would use to produce the furniture that they would sell. The two metrics that they really always were tracking were shorts and splits. So what are shorts and what are splits? So when you're doing real-time manufacturing, you are loading a truck by the end of the day, let's say, that needs to deliver those 6 chairs that have been ordered to some other location so they can eventually make it to the final customer. If by any reason you load 5 chairs and you leave one for the next day, you are gonna not be able to make a profit out of that sale. So what they really care about is to ship all of the contents of a purchase within the same package. That's a split shipment. And a short anticipates a split, meaning that we're running short. By the end of the day, we might have a split. The rate of splits is very low. They almost always get it on time, but that's really what moves the needle there. And what that tells you is that, well, this company that is focused on office furniture manufacturing, the real capability that they have is a logistics capability, and the reason why they're in Michigan is not because in Michigan you have a lot of wood, is because, in Michigan you have that history of manufacturing that allows them to move in a way that is really efficient. So it shows you that sometimes these input-output relationships or these ideas that we have about how industries are connected, it's naive, and that when you get into understanding the process of a particular firm, the connections might be not the ones that you expected.
Another example I can give that's quite similar is a talk I heard from the head of strategy at Dell Computers. He said he thought their key source of value was their logistics chain, so assembling the computers from all of the different components and getting them in the right configuration to customers all around the world. So similarly, the logistics was a key source of value for what we think of as a computer company.
Really amazing examples, actually. It really helps you to visualize the kind of things you're talking about, I think. So, Diane, many economists now argue that ideas and data on their own are not enough. They only raise prosperity when they're combined with the right skills, institutions, and infrastructure. Your work on the wealth economy also argues that long-term prosperity depends on the strength of the underlying assets of the economy. If we see intellectual capital as one of those assets, what would a more deliberate strategy for building it look like, and what needs to be in place for it to translate into real gains in productivity and then living standards?
Well, I'm very interested in the way that the different assets that you need to produce economic growth interact with each other. And economies happen in places. So one of the strengths of thinking about economic complexity is that it is very specific about places, be that countries or regions or cities. And places need people, and they have to provide people with the kind of infrastructure they need to get on with their jobs and what they want to do. And so you start thinking about the whole package of assets that enables a place to grow. And so to take the most obvious examples, if you're talking about a knowledge economy and using AI, you need to have broadband infrastructure. People need houses to live in, public transport to get them to the places they work, but they also have to be good places to live and healthy places to live. And so you start to think about what's the natural environment in a place and what are the amenities or cultural assets that it needs. And so you start to think in a much more holistic way about economic growth, which is partly the sort of, hard-headed things that economists famously talk about, and partly about much harder to define and measure. And so I think we're in the very early stages of thinking about the richness of what makes a place thrive. I was really pleased that the economic historian Joel Mokyr was one of the winners of the Nobel Prize this year, because he does bring to life the very rich characteristics of the culture and the institutional environment that enabled the UK, for example, to launch the Industrial Revolution and grow in the 19th century.
And we're very much seeing that, certainly in Cambridge at the moment, where there's lots of growth happening and actually the infrastructure isn't there, the place isn't there to attract companies. They want their staff to be able to get to work on decent roads and with public transport and the basic stuff. Do you see a similar thing in France, César? Do they see the holistic picture?
I wouldn't comment on France in particular, but I would comment on the more general question about the development of place. And there is a phrase that I always stuck with me from Land Pritchett, which is a well-known development economist. His answer to the question, well, what's the problem with a developing country, or why is this developing country not working well? And he would say everything. And the idea of everything was that in reality development is not about one thing or another, but it's about this complementarity of lots of different things. And I think that is something that we understand. It's hard to quantify, as Diane was saying. And at the same time, the things that we can group, like knowledge or, let's say, institutions, might be things that sometimes are the horse or sometimes are the carriage. So in the book, I have a chapter that focuses on this tension between institutions as the explanation to economic development and knowledge accumulation as the explanation of knowledge development. I tell a couple of stories that show examples of institutions being demanded by the more knowledge-intense workers of an economy. So I tell the story of Chen Chungxiang. He's a Chinese physicist that went to the United States to see how Americans were building fusion reactors. What he's most amazed about is not the technology that Americans have, but the fact that a lot of the parts and pieces that were used in American fusion reactors were done by companies of professor entrepreneurs that involved only a few people. And what he starts really pushing and advocating for is this idea of professor entrepreneurship. So you have an example here of a country that did not have an institution that was geared towards intellectual property and entrepreneurship, and you have someone in the early 80s advocating for that, but the person that is advocating for that in the early 80s is someone that is coming from the highest knowledge sectors of the economy. I have another example that I think is interesting that shows when technology precedes changing institutions, which is the development of the printing press. It's very hard to understand reformation without the development of the printing press. So you have periods in time in which sometimes institutions are the ones that are, the agents of change, but other places in which the development of knowledge or technology is the one that shapes institutions.
Yes, César, your work shows that economies tend to develop by building new capabilities that are connected to what they already know how to do. So what can policymakers do to support that process of capability building in ways that actually translate into long-term prosperity?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we discovered a long time ago is that there's a principle in economic geography that tells you that the probability that an economy enters an activity increases with the number of related activities that are present in a location. Now, a lot of people, when we first came up with that idea, had the knee-jerk reaction that what economists should do is enter the related activities. And then as we continued to do research on this topic, we realized that that was not a very good idea because, sometimes the related activities are going to bring you to a dead end. So they might be easy to enter, but they might not give you opportunities further down the line. What you would discover is that what you have is some sort of portfolio framework in which you should target related activities and unrelated activities, and the composition of the portfolio changes with your level of complexity. It goes up and then goes down, meaning that there's a moment during a country's development trajectory when taking risks, when trying to do things that are different from the ones that they do, it's optimal. And there are moments in which that is not. Now, more recently, what we've done is we embed all of these ideas into optimization frameworks. And we're using this in some of our development work. So I was recently in Rwanda, and we're helping them develop a strategy for diversifying these exports that takes into account these constraints while balancing related and unrelated diversification. We did similar work in Mozambique. We're doing work like that in Abu Dhabi, and we're talking with a few other countries. So you now have, I think, a more principled way to understand where an economy might go, without simply pushing it to what the inertia of the principle of relatedness would tell you. Sometimes you need to defy it, and you need to do that carefully.
So one of the messages I take from César's work is that places do differ in important ways, and you need to have enough local knowledge about where they've come from and what the possibilities might be. Sometimes you get a game in Christmas crackers where you have got to get 6 or 7 little silver balls all into the holes at the same time. And the policy problem is a bit like that. You've got to understand the context and hit lots of different things simultaneously in a coordinated way. So one of the questions in my mind now is, what's the best level of policy decision making for growth to happen? Which kinds of policies need to happen at the national, the regional or the city level? For the UK, which is a very centralised economy, we're at one extreme among all the developed economies. For me, for the UK, this pushes us towards more local decision making, where actually it's easier to get that coordination among the businesses and non-profits and government agencies that are involved.
Okay, we always like to finish by looking ahead into the future. If we accept that intellectual capital will be one of the main engines of prosperity, what's the one change you would each make to policy, institutions, or the way markets are organised to maximise the benefits of intellectual capital for everyone? César, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I would emphasize like 2 things. The first one is, I think you need to have a labor market that is relatively fluid. If you think about economic growth as your goal, and economic growth being a consequence of the accumulation of knowledge, you need systems that can learn. There's learning that happens at the level of individuals, but there's learning that happens at the organizational level as people change who they work with or which tools they specialize in or which tasks they're performing. If we have labor markets that are extremely static, meaning that people basically stick to their job for their entire life, you're going to have a system that is going to struggle with learning, and you're going to be trading off stability for learning. So that's, I think, one of the elephants in the room right now when it comes to policy, in which you have countries that have adopted different models. The US being an extreme, is at-will employment. Europe being another extreme, in which people try to stick it throughout their lives in the same job once they get a permanent position. And I think we're seeing in some way the trade-offs of these 2 models when we look at the performance of both economies.
And do you mean labour moving between different industries, say, in one country, or do you mean across countries? Because obviously we're seeing issues now with immigration around the world, which is, stopping people moving around.
Of course, there's much more mobility within country or within a city than between countries. And I think that local mobility is extremely important. When it comes to global mobility, I think there's many different ways to think about it. There is a humanitarian way of thinking about it, which is anybody should have the right to work or live anywhere. There is a more restricted way to think about it, which is if we want to maximize the growth or the capabilities of our own place, we have to be very selective at who we incorporate into our economy, because we want people that are going to bring a lot of talent, bring a lot of knowledge. So if you want to maximize the growth of knowledge in your economy, you want to be a little bit more selective. If you see migration as a humanitarian need, then you might take a different approach.
I have another question on that. When it comes to sort of moving between sectors and so on, are you saying basically, for example, in Europe, people would be less keen to do it because they're sort of brought up to expect to work in one sector for their whole lives, and perhaps they would need retraining, or that they could be more fluid and move around? Is it down to individuals, to persuading individuals to move around?
I don't think it's about persuading individuals. I do think that structurally, the system is set up in such a way that the costs that are required to change are relatively large and are incorporated by the employers themselves in their calculations. So it is very hard to fire someone in, let's say, France, Italy, or Spain, not so much in Northern Europe. And as a consequence of that, employers are also very cautious about when they open a position, how do they vet people, and how often they open positions. So it's not a market in which there's a lot of positions being open and people are looking to move every 4 or 5 years. While in the US, you do see a lot of dynamism. You see like people, that let's say enter the biotech sector, climbing up by moving sideways between companies, because that ability to move is built into the system. And there's a culture that develops, I think, as a consequence of that. So I don't think it's just a matter of personal perception. I think institutionally, the systems are quite different.
It's interesting. It's the labour protections. And what about you, Diane? If you had to basically do something with policy of institutions or markets or the way they're organised, what big change would you make to make sure that intellectual capital was spread around?
I think I'd give a similar answer to César. We're in a situation where the world economy's had several successive huge shocks since the financial crisis. We've got two major new technological revolutions in energy and AI coming along. So the economy needs to be flexible to use these new possibilities. And if you look more broadly than the labour market, there's a lot of regulatory undergrowth that's stopping new kinds of business models, stopping people changing what they're doing. Now, this is tricky because a lot of regulation is there for very good reason, so you need to be a bit forensic about it. But I do think this issue of an economy that's too tightly bound by regulations is going to have to change for us to get the full advantage of the new knowledge opportunities.
That's fascinating stuff. Thank you both very much. That's all we've got time for this episode. So thanks to Diane Coyle from the Bennett School of Public Policy and César Hidalgo from the Toulouse School of Economics for joining us. And thank you for listening to Crossing Channels. We'd love to hear what you think. Your reviews help us shape future episodes and make it easier for new listeners to find the show. If you enjoyed this one, why not explore some of our earlier episodes too? And please join us next month when we'll be exploring the key issues and choices involved in climate policy making.